Question for you. Have you ever had a conversation with a guest that you invited to your table that just really got awkward? Can you think of a time where all of a sudden the people around the table got really uncomfortable? Well, today we're going to look at a account in history where Jesus was invited to another Pharisee's home. He got invited to the Pharisees' homes quite a bit. It was things that they did. And this time there's Pharisee with other Pharisees, and there's lawyers. Now, maybe not lawyers that you're thinking of. Lawyers were the people who could interpret the law, and they were the ones that knew the law really, really well. And so you have these people at the table along with Jesus. Now, I know it sounds like a bad joke. You got this bad joke, which is knock, knock, who's there? Well, we got some Pharisees, we got some lawyers, and we got Jesus. No thanks, I'm not interested. You wouldn't want to come to that table. This is one of those times where the conversation is going to get really awkward, and we're going to look at this together. So let's just dive in right now. Luke 11:37. It says, as Jesus was speaking, one of the Pharisees invited him home for a meal. So he went and he took his place at the seat. So let me just show you what he did. He walked in and he took his seat at the table. His host was amazed that he sat down to eat without performing the hand-washing ceremony required by Jewish custom. There's the hand-washing bowl here that everyone was supposed to get to go through this ritual and wash their hands before they came to the table to eat. Now, this bowl wasn't about hygiene as much as it was about a custom. And we're going to look at this here in a second. What they would call it was the tradition of the elders. In Matthew's gospel, that's what it calls it. But let's look in Mark just for 1 second. We're going to detour here. The Pharisees and the Jews do not eat unless they give their hands a ceremonial washing, holding to the tradition of the elders. We're going to look at that in a second. When they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash, and they observe many other traditions, such as washing of cups, pitchers, and kettles. What does this mean? Now, I'm going to give you a Hebrew word here for a second. It's called halakha, not Hanukkah. This is halakha. Halakha is the totality of laws and ordinances that have evolved since Bible times to regulate religious observances and the daily life and conduct of the Jewish people. It could describe the way that you would walk out the scriptures. You know how we say, hey, let your talk match your walk? This is what it's talking about. It's religious rulings that they had, traditions of what it looked like to live out Torah, and ceremonial washing became one of them. Does anyone know how many laws there are in the Bible? Any guesses? 613, somebody said. That's right. Someone took the time to name them all, or to write down them all, or count them all. And these laws, these 613 laws, did you know that washing of hands was not one of them before a meal? Around these laws, they would put up these fences, these 613 laws, so you didn't break any of the laws. This was called the Mishnah. Maybe you're familiar with that word. The Mishnah then became the Talmud. And this became an even larger fence or barrier around the 613 laws, just so you wouldn't break one of the laws. And that is what was called the tradition of the elders. They added rules so you didn't break the rules. It's not wrong to have boundaries. It's not wrong to have traditions. It's not wrong to have customs that you follow. But the problem is that they used their traditions to get around the very heart of Torah. And that was the problem. Now, we don't do that today, thank goodness. Sarcasm. We don't come up with loopholes that give us permission to not even do what Jesus asks of us. I'm so glad that we're just not like the Pharisees were that were around this table. Now, what's happening here as Jesus is talking with the Pharisees? They were judging Jesus because he didn't perform the complex washing ritual that they had made a law. The Torah, again, does not say anywhere that they need to wash their hands before they eat. But Jesus sees it for what it is. It's a man-made ceremony meant to make people feel that they are acceptable to God. So let's see where this goes. Then the Lord said to them, as Jesus is sitting here, he looks at the Pharisees, he says, "You Pharisees are so careful to clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside you are filthy, full of greed and wickedness. Fools." He's a guest at this house. "Fools, didn't God make the inside as well as the outside? So clean the inside by giving gifts to the poor, and you will be clean all over." Wow, things are getting uncomfortable. But if there's ever a time where Jesus is kind of just pushed to the edge, it's now. Jesus is holding nothing back. He's got his audience, and he's about to share what needs to be said. He's at the point where he is going to give these guests seated around this table a heart check. And he's going to call them out for going through the motions with the wrong heart. They all had washed their hands before they sat down for a meal, and yet their hearts are filthy. So I don't know about you, but when COVID was happening and we had to wear masks everywhere and in the malls, if you remember going to every store, they had these hand washing stations. And let me ask you, if anyone, can you just be honest? By the fifth store, your hands are cracked because you've had so much sanitizer on them. Did anyone do the fake pump? I did the fake pump a lot. It's just you pretend, well, it's kind of like this is happening. Jesus is about to rebuke them that God cares about what goes on inside our hearts, not just what we look like on the outside, because something has gone wrong with their hearts. And so, Jesus is about to speak 6 woes to them. The version of Bible that I'm using is the NLT. It doesn't use the word woe, but these are woes. It says it a little differently, and we'll see that here in a minute. But this is how he starts with the first woe. Love of religiosity that trumps the love of neighbor and the love of God. He wants nothing to do with it. It shows that your heart is filthy. And so this is what he says. "What sorrow," or woe to you, "what sorrow awaits you, Pharisees, for you are careful to tithe even the tiniest income from your herb gardens, but you ignore justice and the love of God. You should tithe, yes, but do not neglect the most important things." So Jesus is calling them out. Man, they had the ritual of tithing down. And Jesus is saying that tithing is important, yes, but if your heart's not right, you're missing it. So by religiosity, what we mean is someone who loves being religious. Have you met that person before? Today, it would be those who love going through the motions. For some of us, going to church is going through the motions. It's because it makes us feel good. It's putting our offering in the offering box because we feel good. It's maybe singing the songs. Let me give you, for instance, we're going to sing later on. We're going to put a lot of concentration into the notes of the songs because, man, it sounds fantastic when we all do that. Sounds like heaven it's going to sound, I'm sure. Just blended voices is great. But can we get so critical of the notes and forget the message of the song? Sometimes. There's times I've learned a whole song and I got the notes down perfectly, but it's like, if you ask me what it's about, oh, what do you mean? I don't know. And we do that. But the same person who loves being religious might be in constant conflict with their neighbor, or always fighting with their coworkers, or better yet, have an unsettled problem with the person that is sitting at the other end of the congregation. And also, they're not being generous to the poor. Everything is for show, and they were neglecting the most important things. That's why earlier Jesus said, clean the inside by giving gifts to the poor, and you will be clean all over. Religious rituals and practices mean nothing if they do not transform the heart of the person. The second thing he's going to say woe to is their pride. In verse 43, he says, "What sorrow awaits you, Pharisees?" Just imagine you're at this table with this group, and Jesus is calling them out, and he says, "You Pharisees, for you love to sit in the seats of honor in the synagogues and receive respectful greetings as you walk in the marketplaces." It was all about pride and being seen. I don't know if you remember this, but when I was young, and I think here too, if just from talking, you used to have chairs up here where the elders or the leaders come and sit. I'm not saying it was a prideful thing, but I'm saying they did the same kind of thing. But when people sat in these chairs, there was some kind of, look at me, I'm up here. And so he's calling them out on their pride. The most respected teachers and elders sat in the front of the synagogue facing the congregation. But then Paul, who had an apocalypse, we found out, he had an apocalypse on the road to Damascus, where he saw a vision. And he came in contact with Jesus, and Jesus asked him, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" And Saul's life completely changed. He went from persecuting the church to actually planting churches. But this is what he says, Paul. He says, "Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility consider others better than yourselves." That is the heart that Jesus is after, a humble heart. It's the type of authentic heart that Jesus is looking for. And the third thing he calls them out for is infecting others. Listen to what he says. He says, "What sorrow awaits you, for you are like hidden graves in a field. People walk over them without knowing the corruption they are stepping on." Now, this might be a little harder for us to understand, but in Israel, they had tombs that were like containers, and these were rooms to store bones. They were made to look white or whitewashed, so they can look like white monuments. We have gravestones today, but back then you would just wash the outside of the tomb, because if you got anywhere close to it and you were a visitor, you could step on a grave and be unclean for a whole week. Numbers 19, verse 16 says, "If you touched a bone or a grave, you were unclean for a week until you underwent a cleansing process." So what Jesus is basically saying is that when people come in contact with you Pharisees, you make them unclean, just like stepping on a grave. That would hurt. And Jesus is looking for a heart of integrity. And integrity is that what's on the outside matches what's on the inside. It means that you're honest and you're reliable. And it means that you are who you say you are. Integrity means that you're the same when no one is looking as you are when you're around people. And a follower of Jesus who lacks integrity can lead others astray without knowing it. But now the conversation is turned towards the experts in religious law. He's done talking to the Pharisees, 3 woes to them. He's going to give 3 woes to the religious leaders, the lawyers. But this is what one of the lawyers says. "Teacher," said an expert in religious law, "you have insulted us too in what you just said." Okay, in other words, we're getting really uncomfortable here. I don't know if the food's going to taste all that good because you're making us feel really uncomfortable. Let's see what Jesus says. These people were referred to as lawyers, but let's see if Jesus kind of lays up on them a little bit. "Yes," said Jesus, "what sorrow awaits you, experts in the religious law, for you crush people with unbearable religious demands, and you never lift a finger to ease the burden." Jesus doesn't change his tone. He doesn't apologize. He keeps the pressure on. And just so we're aware, Jesus is love. So whatever Jesus is doing here is out of love. I want you to have an example here for a second of what these people may have been doing. This is something I just thought, how can we relate this to today? Let's say the elders of the congregation decided that they were going to make a playbook for Christianity, for the Edmonton Church of Christ, that outlined what you could say and do, movies you couldn't see, music you couldn't listen to, restaurants you couldn't go to. But then you find out that the elders don't go to these restaurants. They just order takeout from the restaurants. Do we look around at others and judge them for their choices? But then we give ourselves grace when we make the same choices? These lawyers were using the word of God to put heavy burdens on people, but themselves they found loopholes. Do we do that? But this is not Jesus. Jesus says in Matthew 11:28, he says, "Come to me, all of you who are weary and heavy burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke, which is my teaching, upon you. Let me teach you, because I am humble and gentle at heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy to bear, and the burden I give you is light." That's Jesus. Jesus is not putting unbearable religious demands and not even lifting a finger to help. We're going to remember Jesus in just a moment of what he was willing to do to kind of take that burden away from us. Number 2, resisting God's message and his messengers. This goes on for a little bit here. It says, "What sorrow or woe to you, Pharisees, or teachers of the law, for you build monuments for the prophets your own ancestors killed long ago. But in fact, you stand as witnesses who agree with what your ancestors did. They killed the prophets, and you join in their crime by building the monuments. This is what God in his wisdom said about you. I will send prophets and apostles to them, but they will kill some and persecute the others. As a result, this generation will be held responsible for the murder of all God's prophets and from the creation of the world. From the murder of Abel," and for those of you who are doing the Torah, you've just read about this, he's calling Abel a prophet. The murder of Abel all the way to the murder of Zechariah, who was killed between the altar and the sanctuary. Yes, it will certainly be charged against this generation. What does Jesus mean? Now he's going to their history here. It can be a little challenging maybe to follow, but I think what Jesus is saying here is that the lawyers' ancestors killed the prophets, and yet they're setting up monuments for them. And of course, these lawyers believe that if they had been around during that time, they wouldn't have done the same thing. But even as they do this for the prophets, and they do this for those that went before, they're rejecting the one true prophet who is at the table with them. The message here for us today is, do we do the same thing that they did? Do we miss Jesus at the table? The one prophet that the whole Torah spoke about coming is at their table, and they missed him. Actually, this is what it says next. Hindering others from understanding God's word, another sorrow that comes to them. What sorrow awaits you in religious experts in religious law? For you remove the key to knowledge from people. You do not enter the kingdom yourselves, and you prevent others from entering. As Jesus was leaving, get this, the teachers of religious law and the Pharisees became hostile and tried to provoke him with many questions. This was an ugly dinner. And if you're at the table, just picture what it would have been like to be there. Jesus is calling out these lawyers for making it so hard for people to understand what God wants from them. And my question for you, do we do that? Do we do that today? Do we make it so hard for people to find Jesus? I know I have. God is working on my heart. He's transforming me, and I believe he's transforming a lot of us together. But what we need to do is we need to examine our teaching to make sure we're not getting in the way of people finding Jesus. And we need to teach not just with our words, but with our actions as well, and the way we live our lives. The Old Testament taught that God would send his Messiah, and whoever believed in him would be saved. And he's at the table, and they're not coming to him. They refused to come to Jesus and be saved. So my last 2 questions for you this morning are, who do you most relate to at the table? Who do you most relate to at the table? The Pharisees, the lawyers, or to Jesus? And the last question is, what in your heart needs to be cleansed so people can see Jesus more clearly? And I believe this category falls to all of us. We need to ask this question. What am I doing? What traditions or customs do I hold on to that is actually hindering people from getting to Jesus? And that's a question you have to wrestle with. Because Jesus invites us all to the table. And so I've had the privilege this past week to meet with Francis, and I'm so grateful for this time. And so Francis and I talked, and I'm going to ask Francis to come up and lead our minds around the Lord's table. So what I want you to do, if you haven't already, is to get some communion at the back. If you don't have that yet, if you're a guest here, please, you can partake with us. And we'll do that. Thanks.
Good morning, brothers and sisters. Can you hear me without the mic? No. No. Well, Bruce has been talking about mic. Is that on? Is it on? Okay. It's about Jesus invites us to the table. So I did some study on this one. So we're going to go and look at some of the stuff about around the table here. So my question is, what does the Bible say about the table? Well, about the table, we start in Luke chapter 14, verses 12 through 14. When Jesus starts talking to these people, and he says that when you give lunch or dinner, do not invite rich, your friends, your relatives, because they will invite you back. It makes sense. But he said, invite poor, blind, handicapped people, and beggars. Now, Christ is not saying that don't invite your relatives. He's just saying is practice hospitality. Don't look down on poor people. Give them a chance to come to your house, have a lunch, stuff like that. Now, sometimes we say that, well, the person is poor, but we have nothing in common. It could be true. I sometimes have a lunch with my doctors. We have nothing in common. But he doesn't know much about housing, electrical, and plumbing. And I do. And I don't know anything about, he's a cardiologist. So there we go. We don't have to have anything in common to speak to or to invite poor people, not educated, for a dinner. People will invite us when we work for Capital Region Housing, and the lady will invite us. She only speaks Lebanese. I don't speak them. Yet I'll spend 3-4 hours there talking to her. How? I don't know. Probably my hand accent and stuff like that. But one thing we had in common, the food. When the food is around the table, we sat and we ate that together, and we'll just try to talk much as we can, spend hours there. So when Christ says, have hospitality towards less fortunate, and as a Christian, we should look into that. And then, who is welcome at the table? Well, Christ welcomes everyone, all nationalities, even Polish people. That's for Walter. But those who have been to the table often, those who have not been there before for a long time, and those who tried follow Christ, and those who have failed. Now, I'm just going to ask a question here. Those who have failed, question is why? Why did they fail? I'm not going to answer the question. Think about that one. So, and what does the table symbolize? Well, table is a place when you sit and you interact with your friends, your families, your colleagues, and your rivals, and your enemies. Table is a place, it's a piece of furniture. Table is neutral. Good thing is, table don't have any ears to hear. So you take a bunch of lumber and you give it to me, I will build you a table. Table is neutral. This is where we get together and discuss lots of things. Happy, sad, any kind of stories while we're having lunch or dinner with our families and friends. So the table with the conversation that we are having can shape us, can define us, and determines our everyday lives. Okay, so why is eating together is important in the Bible? Jesus Christ shared with his meal with rich, poor, all kinds of people. He wasn't fussy whether you were rich, poor, or what. He will share a meal with you, with us, with anyone, with sinners. Of course, everybody's sinners. But when he does that, it shows the equality of the kingdom. It's nobody is above anybody when Christ is eating with them. We are all equal. As I said before, on the cross, it's a level ground. No matter what is the position in this world, it's a level ground. So when we eat together, when we are gathered together and eat, we represent earthly of heavenly banquet. Now, this is reinforced by Jesus Christ time after time. He teaches this way, and through his action, you can tell, you can see this is what Christ is doing. He doesn't have any favorites, place to go and eat. You invite him, he'll come. As simple as that. So, what did Jesus do at the table? Well, Jesus took bread and said, "This is my body." It was in his body that he lived a life here on this earth that God required him to do that. He was obedience to God and did everything God wanted him to do. And the bread, of course, we know that represents his body, and he was completely obedient to God. Our Christian lives at their best are a work in progress.